My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we brave the underground lair of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. Tom, tell us about the Warlock of Firetop Mountain.
The Warlock of Firetop Mountain is a dungeon-based adventure for advanced fighting fantasy, published by Arion Games, in which the adventurers try to reach the inner sanctum of the eponymous villain, whether to pilfer his treasure or for, some other reason. It was adapted into an RPG scenario by Brett Schofield, and it's based on the fighting fantasy choose-your-own-adventure gamebook of the same name, which was written by Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson, and was the first book in the fighting fantasy gamebook line, published in 1982. The art is by Russ Nicholson, that's from the original gamebook, and Brett Schofield, who did new illustrations and maps that are included. It begins with 10 pre-generated player characters for the advanced fighting fantasy game, of whom only 2 are female, a complete map of the dungeon, and a prologue section which is set in a village near Firetop Mountain, where you can get random rumours and so on. And then it's straight into the dungeon. Act 1 is the Orc Barracks, which, as the name suggests, is a place where the players have to get past numerous orcs and a few goblins, and with the possibility of rescuing a prisoner or two and picking up some useful items. Act 2 is the Caverns, featuring tougher monsters, puzzles, traps, and an underground river, which they have to cross in order to get to Act 3. Act 3 is the Inner Sanctum, where they'll find the Warlock's undead servitors of various kinds. They have to navigate a labyrinth, which also has a minotaur inside it, and teleport traps that make everything confusing. And finally, Act 4, because the Inner Sanctum name was a tad misleading, is called the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, and that's where, assuming they make it past the guard dragon, the party will come face-to-face with the Warlock himself. That concludes the adventure portion, and then the book's rounded out with an additional resources section with brief details on the villages near the dungeon, some random encounters for different areas, random treasure tables, and additional background material about the setting.
Awesome. Well, why don't we talk about what we liked about this module? I didn't say loved, because I'm not sure I can reach that state. Wow. I know you may, but let's talk about it though.
Well, I'm in kind of the same place. I think a lot of what I like about this is, I'm not afraid to admit it, this is a massive nostalgia trip for me, okay? Because the Fighting Fantasy introductory role-playing game, as it was called then, was my very first RPG. Let me paint you a picture here, Jason. The year is 1991. Bryan Adams was riding high in the charts. Roseanne was teaching us what it was to laugh about everyday life. And a young me and my friends Tony and John at a primary school in Hertfordshire were sitting on the school bench with fighting fantasy game books, having sort of invented a kind of pseudo role-playing for ourselves. One of us would read out the text and the others would kind of collectively, vaguely in character, decide what to do next. And then one day, Tony brought in this weird-looking, slightly different book with a were-tiger bursting out of a D6 on the cover. And that was my first taste of RPGs. So this fighting fantasy aesthetic and everything that goes with it is really drawing on kind of almost primordial memories for me and those feelings. So I obviously I like that because it's personal to me, but more generally I like it because it's OSR of a different kind of OS. It's a whole kind of different strand from the traditional D&D OSR.
I certainly don't have that same level of nostalgia that kind of pulls me into this, right? I don't even know if we got the fighting fantasy books over here. I certainly don't remember them from when I was a kid. I've only known about them as an adult, and I actually only know about them because they started publishing them on iPad and iPhone, right? So, which is how I even learned about them in the first place. So I don't have that. But, I get it. I mean, I still enjoy the Dragonlance Chronicles novels, from my youth, even though I'm sure those probably are not going to read very well to modern sensibilities, right? So I get it. So I can't say I loved much about this module, but having said that, we have a format here. And I thought the art was really good, actually. So once you get past the pre-gen character portraits in the beginning, which are not so great in my opinion, I would feel a little bad if I was an adventurer and that's what I had to go out looking like. I would feel like I would have worse problems to deal with. The art is actually quite good, and there's a lot of it. So it's sort of like just black and white line illustrations or whatever, but it has this very like textured quality to it. The characters are very rangy and expressive, and several of the pieces, particularly there's one of this like old emaciated man and another one of a zombie. They're really disgusting. like the level of texture is gross.
The prisoner that comes charging at you, is that the old man?
Yeah, there's that. Yeah, that one. And there's also a zombie, like a real close up like drawing of a zombie, and the artist went into so much detail, like showing his various flaps of skin hanging off his face and the tendrils and things. It's just disgusting. So I think the art's actually really solid there, and there is quite a bit of it. You said most of that came from the original Fighting Fantasy book, though, right?
I can't remember clearly enough to vouch for all of it, but basically, yeah, and any of the interior adventure illustrations you see are from 1982, and then the sort of peripheral things in the maps, they were added for this in 2014.
Yeah, okay, cool. The other thing that I don't know if I like it as much as I think it's interesting, and so maybe worth talking about, which is, as I was reading through the module, I got thinking, if you took all the dungeon crawls that were ever created, since the late 70s till today, and you somehow transform them into data that you could feed into a computer, and then you ask that computer to produce the ideal dungeon crawl, I think you would get the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I really do. It is like a greatest hits of like dungeon crawl encounters, right? You start with orcs and goblins, you move on to an ogre, then pit traps, then a troll, then giant rats, then an evil librarian with a gremlin, a weird visual puzzle room, a giant, a sandworm, a giant spider, an iron golem, zombies, vampire, ferrymans and hellhounds, minotaurs, a dragon at the end, and then the final boss. It's pretty tropey. It has all the greatest hits of dungeon crawls.
Yeah, it's pretty complete. Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I do think there's an audience for this. I think there's something you can do with this. And I think maybe that's something we're going to talk about later. But at the outset, I find it interesting. What other things did you like about it before we kind of move on?
Well, and I think we may have to talk more about this later in the episode. It's a bit of what is called a funhouse dungeon, where you put together set pieces and encounters with maybe less emphasis on, is this plausible? Is there an explanation for how everything works here? And more on just having exciting encounters. Although what I like about the backstory here is that a lot of the time it seems like rooms are designed just to mess with you, but because there's an evil wizard, they are. So now that doesn't quite work for every portion of this dungeon, but it works for enough of them that I think it's interesting. And I also like the structure to it. There's quite a lot of implied backstory and things going on. So each of the three sections sort of has a relationship to what's going on further in the dungeon. There's a sense that you're exploring the past as you go into the dungeon. So things that the Warlock decided on years ago are what you're making your way into now. And I think this is a bit of a pastime for some people looking at classic dungeon modules, is trying to justify some of the things that are going on in there. Like, I don't know if you've heard of the Holmes game, or the Sherlockian game as it's sometimes called. Dorothy L. Sayers was into this in whenever she was alive. It's the idea of pretending that Sherlock Holmes and all those stories were real, and then trying to account for the inconsistencies and factual errors, and kind of make up often quite convoluted reasons why it's plausible after all.
I see.
So,
I see.
Like there's an example, like Dr. Watson's name is John, right? But in one of the stories, his wife calls him James. Why would that be? So, and I think that the reason that is most popular is his middle initial is H, which could be for Hamish, which is the sort of the Scottish version of James, and that's it. That's what they've got. So,
I love it.
And you can kind of do that with dungeons as well. Like, why are these goblins over here? Well, maybe they did this and this, and yeah. So,
are there people who are into this?
Yeah, there's an entire. Wait, the dungeons thing or the Sherlock Holmes thing is quite a big.
The dungeons thing is.
You sort of. I think anytime someone posts a thread on an RPG forum going, I can't understand why X, Y, or Z happened, and then someone will go, well, it could be this.
Well, and it's just, especially in these older modules too, where I think there was less like rigor in terms of like narrative structure or whatever. Some of these older ones, I can kind of see that the desire to want to fill in those blanks or whatever. That's super interesting. The backstory part is interesting because I don't think I picked up on that until I got to the end of the book. The end of the book, there's a lot, like they actually give like the lore of the dungeon.
Yeah, I didn't really read that though. I just...
Yeah, in the back they give you the like actual lore of the various characters, and I actually thought that was really interesting. Like the rest of the dungeon is so clinical, and that part in the back, I was like, oh, there's actually something here. Like these characters actually have a backstory, and they have like something, and that they're up to, and so their behavior in the dungeon actually did make a little more sense in that context, I think.
Yeah, I wonder if that dryness might be a desire to kind of hew quite closely to the original game book, which, because it was the first one, didn't have a whole lot of the world outside, and that kind of developed over time.
That makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Well, so let's talk about questions.
Yeah,
I've got some like real like surface level ones, and then maybe we can go to the. We've been kind of like hinting at this other question of like, well, who is this for in the modern day, right? My surface level questions. I don't understand the dragon situation. So the dragon at the end, which is like the sort of like boss right before the final boss, there's two. They say that there are two dragons in there, and they give you stats for two different dragons, but they say there's only one that you fight.
Yeah.
And I can't figure out, like, do you pick one? Like, what's the deal with the two dragons, one dragon?
I can't cite chapter and verse right now. I'm pretty sure it tells you to pick one based on how beaten up or how strong your party is, and choose the weaker one.
Okay, I must have skipped over that. Okay. Well, then it's extra confusing because at one point in that same dragon part, it says that one of the dragons is always there guarding the door. So anyway, just a bit of inconsistency there.
I guess we'll never know.
So I found the dragon thing to be, I thought it was a little weird. Other question I had is the labyrinth. So, and I'm putting labyrinth in quotes in my voice, if that makes any sense. The text makes you think that this labyrinth is this like crazy mind-bending puzzle, right? If you look at the map, there's not much going on. It's like two left turns.
But it has secret hidden teleport traps, right? So the labyrinth part is predicated on all of the corridors looking the same. So you walk around a corner, you get teleported unknowingly to a different corridor, which is pointing you in the wrong direction, and that's why you get confused.
Okay. All right. I guess that makes more sense with the teleport traps. Okay. All right. Well, that answers
I
that
imagine it's more maddening when you're flipping through paragraphs in a book and you can't figure out why you keep...
Right, yeah. When it's all laid out for you in a map, it seems a little less awe-inspiring. Other little things. Why is there a store in the dungeon? I thought that was strange. There's like a store where you can go and buy things, and I'm like, what's the market
shopping
here?
Yeah. I mean, there is a bit later where the wizard used to have some human servants, but I don't think they go shopping at the store over the bridge.
I'm going to go down and get a pack of gum.
I mean, functionally, of course, is because there's a puzzle later where you need to have a magic blue candle, and this is a place where you can buy magic blue candles. You can
purchase a blue candle, yeah.
That's it. So... Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that was it. Those were my main, like, kind of shallow, like, sort of questions. I think you have more interesting questions.
Do I? Okay, so, well, as we've discussed, right, so for British gamers of a certain age, the appeal of this is pretty obvious. But does it have anything going for a different audience, such as, say, an American gamer of a similar age, or,
At the outset, I'm going to say no, but I'm game to discuss this. I do think there's something interesting about the fact that, like I said earlier, it feels so classic. Like you're reading through it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is like the first dungeon or something. Like it really has that feel. And so I'm thinking, if you were going to, if you wanted to give like your kids who had never. Your kids who are just getting into role-playing games and you want to give them like the sort of core experience, this is not a bad place to go, right? I mean, it's it's not so dark and gruesome that like it wouldn't be easy for kids to sort of process or whatever, except for the picture of that zombie with his face
don't show them the
falling
zombie. Yeah.
but overall though, like it's a, you know, it's kind of like a little romp, right? Like it's not too, it wouldn't be too difficult. Or too
I mean, there's
bad
like there's a scene in a torture chamber, but it pulls its punches pretty much, doesn't it?
Yeah,
So,
it really does. Yeah. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I was thinking was possibly brand new RPG people, like people who are new to like new gamers, people who've never played RPGs. And I say that, this is totally theoretical, but I say that because I one time played with my sisters this little, it was like some little dungeon card game thing, you know, like little card game where you pick a character class and you go through some dungeons and fight some monsters and stuff. And you get points at the end, and you know, just a kind of a little trifle thing. But they really liked it, and they liked it because they had not been exposed to the idea of a cleric or a wizard, right? Like in this context, and they were really into it. They were like, if we play one more time, I can get this spell or whatever, right? And so like they were kind of into that and it was kind of cute because I was like, well, you know, I was like, okay, well, like this is pretty basic stuff as far as dungeon crawling goes, right? I mean, I wasn't being like super patronizing like that just now, but so I'm thinking like, okay, well, if you had a group of brand new players, totally new to RPGs, you wanted to give them like the sort of quintessential dungeon crawl experience, this is maybe not a bad choice.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, anyone who's going to have a sense of wonder at seeing all this new stuff, right? And of course, when it came out originally, the game book, this was what introduced a whole generation of people in the UK and surrounding, well, I guess, and Ireland, maybe, to all these fantasy dungeoneering tropes. D&D wasn't as widely available. In fact, it was Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone are the founders of Games Workshop, which, of course, is a really important thing in bringing role-playing to Britain before they went miniatures heavy.
Right, yes.
So, yeah, I guess that was the original function. But I guess apart from that, the other thing that occurred to me, mainly because I was recently playing a game in which we played monsters in a dungeon, is would it be more fun to play the monsters in the dungeon?
I think so. I have an idea that it might be more fun to just play the monsters.
Yeah, because this game by my friend Benoit is called Dungeon Inc. or Donjon et Compagnie pour notre ami francophone, and kind of unavailable yet, but you can find his posts about it on Google+. And the idea is that the dungeon is a business, and their business model is a bit like a casino, but deadlier. You know, you lure people in, you kill them, take their treasure and swords and their expensive equipment, but you pay out with treasure just often enough to keep people coming back.
That's pretty good. I like that. That's pretty neat. I could see that. I mean, I one time played a game of The Final Girl. Just for listeners who don't know what The Final Girl is, it's a rules light story game where you're kind of doing a horror movie and you create a bunch of characters like troop play style, and you play the characters over different rounds, kind of mixing them up between players, and you kill them all off one by one until there's just one left. And we did one once where we were playing the monsters in a dungeon, and the killer was an adventuring party, you know, and the story became about like their life in the dungeon, you know, with occasionally interrupted by the adventuring party coming in and slaughtering them.
Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah, so that's something for the more experienced gamer. Yeah. Cool.
And you could just use like you could just, instead of like making a whole like thing of characters, you could just use this module as your ecology or your setting,
right?
Just grab all the characters from there. So yeah, it's an interesting thought. But you know, overall, I'm going to suggest that you'd have to have some real specific circumstances to want to pull this one out. I feel like,
yeah, maybe more like, historical interest in anything
or whatever.
Well, that's a good point. Well, let's talk more about that later. Let's do the chain lightning round first.
That's the chain lightning. Okay. I'll start. So I think the text is mostly humorless, but there are a few moments where attempts at comedy are made, and these attempts are so unfunny that they circle back around to kind of being funny. So, for example, you encounter some mining tools that are floating ghostly and singing hi-ho, which I thought was not funny at all until I thought about it for a minute. And it still was just maybe barely funny. Another was the standing dead. There are these zombies that like purposely just stand in one place. They are not the walking dead. They are the standing dead. And they always go back to their standing position. So, haha. There is one moment of genuine good humor, though, and this is kind of the thing I really want to say. There's one point where you're facing these orcs, and they're so desperate that they just start haplessly throwing rat bones at you. They pull out of a cauldron of soup. It's just a ridiculous visual. So, sorry, that was long, but yeah.
Oh, it's okay. My first one is the boathouse. There's a portion quite deep into the dungeon where a bunch of, I think, skeletons or whatever are building a boat. Now, there is an underground river, but it's just not really explained at all. And there's so many tantalizing possibilities of what the Warlock is planning to do with his skeleton-built boat. I find it intriguing and alive with opportunity.
There's a portion where some orcs are playing some gambling games. It's near the beginning in the Orc Barracks Act. They're playing these gambling games, and there are 3 games they're playing. One of the games is basically exploding Russian roulette. Another game is that game where you move the knife around your fingers and you could possibly slice off your finger. I don't know what that's called, but you see it in, like, spy movies all the time. And then the third game is just rolling some dice. Wow. I kind of love that because it's like, why would you play those other 2 games when you could just go roll the dice and win money? But anyway, for thrill seekers, I suppose.
My next one is there's a room where you can encounter 2 kinds of quite similar undead monsters. There's a vampire with an eye and 1 or more vampires with a Y, a distinction that barely works in text and almost certainly not when said aloud. I think this one might be a thing I quote-unquote like rather than actually like.
Like all the things I'm saying.
Yeah.
My final one is I actually really enjoy the naming scheme in this game, or this text, rather. The names of things are quite great. Olfin Redhammer, Laertes Lapwing, Vigor Firestorm, Olderon Zagor. Very, very trad fantasy, very weird, kind of heavy metal. I'm into it. Not all the names are great, though. See The Sword of Sharpness, which is a really uninspired, terrible name for a magic sword.
My final one is, I think, a good bit of atmosphere building, though, which is an offhand mention of, well, basically in the undead section, all of those servants used to be alive, but then there was a food shortage for a while, so the Warlock just let them all die and then raised them as undead. So that's a pretty good way to
I like that
underscore him being a bit
really
evil. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. So today what we're mostly talking about for the Expert Delve is this module has a quality that I don't think I've seen much in other adventure modules, which is it feels really staged. For example, every time, when you walk into a room, the characters are just in that moment doing the high drama thing, right? So you walk into the torture room, and that's the precise moment that the orc chief is whipping the other orc. You turn the corner, and that's just when the ogre's returning home to his lair. You walk into this one room and the dwarves are just in the middle of their card game, right?
Or the Minotaur actually is like you can't meet it in the labyrinth. You only meet it when it surprises you in that room.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's super staged. It has a really strange feeling as you're reading through it because it just feels like this sequence of staged events. And so we're going to talk about some different things surrounding that. Tom's got some ideas about the sort of history of the game's development or the module's development and why it might seem like that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about point crawls. And then I have some ideas about actually leaning into the staginess of this module to get something out of it. So Tom, kick us off.
Yeah, let's do the background bit. So it was while running Warlock of Firetop Mountain as a PvP that it occurred to me for probably the first time that this kind of game book is what we would now call a point crawl. So that is particularly found in OSR, but you see it elsewhere as well. A scenario that's mapped out, but not physically. It's kind of nodes that are points of interest that might be physical spaces or events that are going to happen, and often a mix of the two, like you've mentioned, so that you go into one room and it's when this certain thing is happening. And the advantage of these is that they kind of reduce paralysis by analysis because you don't have that many choices. In a hex crawl, for example, you're exploring a wide open sandbox. There's literally millions of things, different decisions you could make. But with a point crawl, you've got 3 exits from where you are now. You choose one of those 3. That's it. And yeah, that's how a fighting fantasy gamebook works, right? You flip to the next paragraph. It doesn't correlate to a particular distance or time. It's just the next interesting thing that happens. It could be seconds later, years later. You don't know. So yeah, in that way, they're very flexible because they can go to one-off events. So you might meet an NPC once, and then like you can't really pass through that node again. It ceases to exist. But others will be like the castle or the village, all that kind of stuff.
Well, to be perfectly clear, just because I don't know if we've unpacked it quite maybe like we should have, but these fighting fantasy game books, they were like choose your own adventure books, right? I mean, you would, my knowledge of them is like basically it was like a choose your own adventure, except there was a little bit of dice rolling too.
There's a combat system in it, yeah. Or sometimes skill or luck rolls, yeah. But still the basic mechanic is, to attack the goblin, turn to paragraph 20, to tempt him with a vial of cochineal, turn to paragraph 373, that kind of thing. And yeah, go on. Yeah,
so you can kind of see how, like knowing that, you can kind of see how like if they're adapting that game book, that choose your own adventure style book to a module, maybe how the module ended up the way it did, like seeming like just a sequence of like weird events, right?
Right, but I would say that arguably adding the maps to this, and especially for me, because I actually showed portions of the map to my player, I think that works against the value of the point crawl because you're turning those nodes into locations with concrete spaces between them. And that can really slow things down by turning what's supposed to be a instant hop to the next thing into that slower fantasy Vietnam, checking for traps, listening at doors kind of business.
So you're suggesting that like maybe it's a detriment to have it be that way. Like, I mean, because I find it really interesting that the module actually tells you like, all this stuff is happening, but it repeatedly says, even though all this is happening, don't forget to also roll random encounters. Like the module wants you to be doing more of a dungeon crawl type thing, you know, but it doesn't actually tell you what to do.
I don't think that works. And especially when I was running it as PvP, right? As you know, any extra action you take in PvP is probably going to take a day to resolve. So I started off having people doing stuff like they're listening at the doors or assessing the situation. And I realized I was wasting time because what would happen is, well, there's a couple of things that are going to happen, right? Either it's going to be perceived as dangerous and they'll fight or run away, or it's kind of a fun scene and they'll immediately recognize that, like, oh, I can talk to this guy, I can do some kind of interaction. But if they misidentify it, then they'll just sort of not engage with the stuff and then you're missing out. Whereas the fighting fantasy game books, they just push you right into the threshold. You turn to that paragraph and immediately the wizard's saying, oh, come in, have some tea. There's no point where you can go, well, that wizard looks dangerous. I think I might steer clear of this. And I realized that's what I had to start doing. And that's literally what I did. I would say something like, you open the door. I wouldn't give them the opportunity to not open the door. I would just be, okay, this happens. And then.
Right. Yeah. Well, you can kind of get away with it and play by post, right? Because because we're not like talking to each other at a table, you can kind of hand wave all that stuff, right? And just like sort of hard frame everything, like in your responses and things. What about like at the table though? Like, do you think there's a lesson there for like running it at the table?
I think so. I think you could just choose sometimes to do it. And as long as you are sticking to that kind of, I'm not going to screw you over without telegraphing your opportunities to get away contract, I think that's okay to occasionally skip the discern realities roll or the listening at doors and just look guys, this is a fun one where the goblins don't try to kill you and they offer you soup. Come on, let's just do this.
Let's just have this scene and see how it goes. Yeah, you could play it that way. I mean, one thing I noticed as I was going through the book was one thing that occurred to me. The game actually doesn't have like, I don't know much about like the advanced fighting fantasy role-playing game. I don't know much about it mechanically, but just based off the stat blocks that I saw in the book and the mechanics that it calls upon, it seems pretty simple, right? It doesn't seem like there's much to it.
Stats.
Yeah. Like it's the stat blocks were like really simple. And I was thinking, gosh, I mean, I think the reason why maybe this book might appeal in a way that we're about to talk about, like using it as set dressing for something else, or like what we talked about earlier, like using it for the final goal or for Dungeon Inc. there's not much to adapt, right? I think this would work really well in Dungeon World, right? I mean, it's about encounters, it's about scenes, and if you already kind of play your game in a sort of like I do, like in this sort of writer's room, we're making a film kind of like way, just like frame up your scenes. Like who cares about the actual like crawl part of it, right? Just get to the interesting bits. I can see that. I mean, and I think that's not because the module seems so much more about like the character of the encounter, than the actual stats. I think you can do that, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like if you will, a theme park ride where you're going and looking at all the different things.
Theme parks. What a great segue. Shall we segue into theme parks?
Yeah.
So here's my idea. Okay. Leaning into the staginess of this module, and it's really stagey. As I was reading through it, I was also thinking, this feels like a theme park. There's actually an illustration and a bit of text that it's like a little tree stump carved to look like a chair, like a spot where you can sit.
Yeah.
And it has a sign that says, "Rest ye here, weary traveler." And when I saw that, I was like, that looks like something you'd see in a theme park, right? Like some little thing. Some of the like scripted monologues and speeches that the characters give sound like things that animatronics would say when you turn the corner, right? Such as the final boss who says, "Welcome, adventurers. I have been expecting you," right? Like, it's got a theme park vibe to it, right? Every time you walk into a room, the orcs are always doing this particular thing. Every time you go here, the Minotaur is always doing this thing. And so I got thinking, what if you were to take this module and make it your setting for a game that is basically like Westworld, okay? Westworld, of course, is I'm talking about the HBO series here, science fiction television series where people go to this Old West theme park, and it's very realistic, and it's run by these robots called hosts, and the robots are scripted to do certain activities at certain times of the day. And so the guests are all dressed up in their cowboy wear, and they go through the theme park, and they have little adventures, they get in shootouts, and that kind of thing with these hosts, these little robot hosts who are programmed to give them this optimal like Old West experience. I think it'd be really fun to do like a Westworld kind of thing, but like with this dungeon crawl being the vacation. A bunch of people like go to this planet where this dungeon is here. Maybe there's other dungeons, but this is one of them. And the robots are like the monsters in various encounters in the rooms, and they're all programmed to be in a certain place and do a certain thing at a certain time. You know, what do you think at the outset?
I think that sounds great.
Okay, good.
rife with possibility. Yeah. Because, I mean, Westworld itself, like, it doesn't seem that promising as a setup, but actually, as it goes along, it gets more and more complex, and there is a lot of fertile ground there.
Yeah, well, so let's talk about, like, maybe the ways you could replicate that possibly in a game. I was initially thinking, if you were going to make it focused on more of like the dungeon crawl part of it than the sort of human robot drama part of it, you could have it where, okay, the characters or the players are playing the guests of this resort, and you could do something like a very lightly reworked World of Dungeons or the Black Hack, and your player characters could just swap out their skill packets or whatever. They could assume a different mantle every day they're there at the park. So, today I want to be a thief, or today I want to be this, and so you'd have like a combination of like their little like the little kit they're outfitted with, combined with their real world skills to be like what their character can do in the dungeon. I think the Black Hack even has like little like kits that you can kind of outfit your characters with, like it comes with like certain little tools and whatnot if you want a thief or you want a warrior or whatever. But then I got thinking there's probably a more interesting game there, and so I reached out to our community for some feedback, and I got some really cool ideas, especially if you were interested in playing like the robots themselves, or a combination of the guests and the robots, and you wanted to really explore
or the staff and crew, maybe.
And exactly right, precisely. So the one game that a lot of people thought would be great is Primetime Adventures, which is a story game, a sort of old workhorse classic story game, where you are basically putting on a TV show, and the game is structured in this really interesting way because every session is a different episode in the TV show, and mechanically the principal characters have more or less importance each episode, which kind of reflects that maybe they are the star of that episode or they're just like kind of a background player in that episode, which is something that happens on real TV shows, right? And so I think Primetime Adventures could be a really great fertile ground for, you know, a sort of like a loose, almost universal story game type system where you could have this story, you know, where, you know, episode 1, we maybe see some of the guests. And then episode 2, we see like one particular robot who's the emphasis, you know, maybe it's the, you know, the orc who lives in, you know, room 10 or whatever. Right. And then the next episode, maybe it's about the maze master. That's an NPC in the setting here, the maze master.
Yeah.
You know, you could imagine the maze master being like the Anthony Hopkins in Westworld, you know, the person who designed it all.
Oh, yeah, sort of is in there as if they're a robot, but they're not really.
Right, exactly.
And actually, that's interesting because the ebb and flow of it could represent and kind of sort of in the back of your mind while you're playing, represent the behind the scenes kind of, I want to do this plot today, and no, we're reworking this so the orcs have a good bit this week, but without having to go through the hassle of playing two.
Oh, so you mean like using the meta talk at the table as like production talk, like of the actual.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't do it in character though. It's just like you can see the effects of it because when one character is the star, then that means that, you know, you can presume that some maneuvering happened and you could dip into that if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's a super
without
cool
having
idea.
to play loads of different characters. Yeah, because cast bloat is a bit of a problem with that kind of game, right? Where you can end up with loads of NPCs, sometimes more than one PC per player. And you would probably want to keep a lid on that, I would think.
Yeah. See, I thought Primetime Adventures was a cool idea. Some other people recommended different things. Paul Beakley, I take it is playtesting a game called Robot Park, which is a GM-less Powered by the Apocalypse game.
I saw the drafts of that.
Yeah, which would be obviously a perfect fit because I think it's about Westworld. It's essentially Westworld, the RPG, from what I could tell. Rach Shelke recommended a reskinned Ryutama. I'm not familiar enough with that game to be able to say how that would go. But
let's just assume it's a great idea.
Yeah, but I didn't have time to really research it, but I would be interested in doing so. Yeah, so my basic point, though, is I think that, you know, the staginess of this old module that came from this kind of unusual source material, I think it's something you can use, right? Like, I found it kind of inspiring. I actually want to do this now, you know?
Yeah. Hey, there we go. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that occurs to me is even if you are doing the straight dungeon crawling one, you would want to incorporate some of that background drama, because one of the things in Westworld is that people bring their own baggage into the park. So even if you're running it pretty straight with like World of Dungeons or Black Hack, you definitely want to make sure all the characters have some beef with each other or with someone that works at the park, or maybe with robots in general. I don't know. And that would add that extra layer that you need, rather than it just being, we're doing a dungeon crawl, but one stage removed. Yeah,
so listeners, if you have any ideas like about how to like pursue this apart from what we've described here, I'd love to hear them because I think this is kind of I don't know, could be fun.
It's got legs, yeah.
Shall we go to the companion adventures? Hi, listeners. I want to interject real quickly to remind you that Gauntlet Con is taking place October 20th through the 22nd. Gauntlet Con is an online gaming convention. We have over 100 gaming events for you to join. Early registration for Gauntlet Patreon supporters is taking place right now. Leading up to Gauntlet Con, our zine, Codex, will be holding a writing contest called Keepers of the Gauntlet. For this contest, we're asking you to write a Dungeon World starter or OSR scenario. There is a $100 cash prize for the winner, and the winning scenario will be published in Codex and be featured on one of our podcasts. Up to 2 runners-up will receive a $50 cash prize. Anyone can participate. The deadline for submissions is October 16th. For more details, find the link in our show notes or go to gauntlet-rpg.com. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. So I'll start. Music suggestion. There is a synthwave album, which I love as a general matter, synthwave, called Out of Body. It's by a band called Dance of the Dead. They're one of my very favorite synthwave, I don't know if band is the right word to use here, but outfits.
Collectives.
They're one of my favorite synthwave outfits. And Dance of the Dead, their albums are they're like they're kind of themed to like 80s genre media, you know? So the newest one is like definitely has influence of like 80s horror movie themes, like that's a thing. There's been like a science fiction one and some other things. Out of Body it's got like fantasy vibes, but it's definitely more like up-tempo. And I think the reason why it appeals to me is because it has the feeling of like a more like up-tempo, slightly lighthearted, kind of like run from one thing to the other sort of fantasy movie a la Labyrinth, like we talked about a while back.
Or Lady Hawk, maybe.
Say it again.
Lady Hawk?
You're like Lady Hawk, exactly right. It's got like more of that vibe to me than something particularly dark and scary. And so it's a cool up-tempo synthwave album that it has some fantasy dashes, and I think it'd be a good fit.
Okay, so my companion adventures recommendation is barely a companion thing. It's just the Fighting Fantasy Gamebooks, which, as you note, are now available on iPhones and Android devices and so on. Specifically the fantasy ones that take place in the shared world that kind of grew out of Firetop Mountain and all that stuff, which is called Titan, I think. And if you had to pick one, I would recommend Creature of Havoc, which is really atmospheric and kind of interesting in lots of different ways. You play an amnesiac monster who just wakes up in a dungeon tunnel not knowing what's going on, and at the start you can't understand any languages. You're not entirely in control of your actions. I think early on, if you try to not kill a party of adventurers, you kill the party of adventurers anyway because you're a ferocious monster. But it is difficult, I will say that, and there is a semi-famous error in one of the paragraphs which can leave you trapped if you don't Google it first. So Google it first. But yeah, other than that,
never fixed it. Like it's just
problem.
I guess they'd have no reason to, right? I mean,
I don't think they have. No. So I mean, if your copy doesn't have that problem, then all is well. But just in case, yeah, Creature of Havoc. Really, I think just a really great concept, and it's set in that same quite distinctive, although I can't explain why, fantasy world.
Awesome. My last recommendation here, in a case of sort of a snake eating its own tail, I suppose, I'm going to recommend the Cheat Your Own Adventure role-playing game. Now, Warlock of Firetop Mountain, of course, is a role-playing game module that came out of a Cheat Your Own Adventure style book, and Choose Your Own Adventure style book, and Cheat Your Own Adventure role-playing game is a role-playing game about Choose Your Own Adventure books.
Yeah. And specifically keeping your thumb in the previous page,
exactly
so
right.
If it's wrong, you can go back.
It's pretty great. So if you listen to our other shows on the Gauntlet, you know this game already. But in case you don't, super fun, very, very rules light. It can support any number of players and plays pretty quickly. But the idea is
so good.
Yeah, it's so good. The idea is you narrate a little bit of a choose your own adventure style story, and then you narrate in the second person, and then when you get to a decision point, the other players at the table present you with an option and tell you what, quote, page number to turn to. There's a little die mechanic that gets increasingly difficult, but basically if you succeed on the die roll, then that choice was a good choice and that person gets to continue the story. If you fail on the die roll, then your character dies and you have to narrate their death. But it's called Cheat Your Own Adventure for a reason, because like Tom said, you have your thumb on the page and you get to go back and choose one of the other options so that you can continue the story. I love the idea of this because I did love Choose Your Own Adventure books. They never had their own spin-off RPG that I'm aware of.
No,
but if they did, we might be talking about some other module today. Who knows? But I love them, and I just think it's kind of fun to explore the sort of like, this sort of the different ways that that the gaming hobby and stuff like kind of crisscrosses. And heck, run Warlock of Firetop Mountain and Cheat Your Own Adventure. You can totally do it.
That's a good point. You could, and it takes about 20 minutes to do a game if you've got.
If you're really
depends.
If you're really kind of into your descriptions and stuff, it's about a solid 30 or 40 minutes. So, but still pretty quick.
Oh, you can. Yeah, that's good.
Well, listeners, that's our show. If you want to get in touch with us, we can be found on our community page on Google+. Just go to G+, and search the community section for The Gauntlet. We are there. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We're on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG, and if you'd like to support us on Patreon, it's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Oh, hey, Tom. Mm-hmm. So I've been thinking about the name of the show, I think, before we head into Season 2, which I don't know if that's happening.
There's a Season 2?
I don't know when people are going to be listening to this, Tom. Before we make any big moves on the show, I think we should go ahead and settle on what we want the name to be, because Fear of Black Dragon is awful. Do you have any ideas for what else we could call it?
I do. I wonder if it's a little bit long, but, let's see what you think. It takes a nation of millions of orcs to hold us back.
Very good. Wouldn't fit great on the logo, if I'm being honest.
No. We'll workshop it.